Okay, I have 12 noon. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us today for session 9 of the Refocus and Rebuild webinars focused on helping Virginia businesses open during a COVID-19 world. My name is Sandy Ratliff. I'm with Virginia Community Capital, and if you're not familiar with us, we are a community development financial institution providing lending, investing, and community innovation services around Virginia. We are happy to be partnering with the Virginia Small Business Development Center Network, Gen Ed's UVA-WISE College of Economic Development, and the Southwest Virginia Alliance for Manufacturing to present this weekly webinar series. This is a 13-week series helping business owners and leaders build skills and knowledge to manage and grow, as well as share resources that can help our businesses in Virginia moving forward during this pandemic. If you noticed in the emails that you received from me, you should have seen some links at the bottom of that with a variety of access to a variety of templates and a guidebook that you can use to refer to in developing your own resiliency plan for your business. And before we get started on this and I turn it over to our co-host, I wanted to remind everyone that in order to keep this webinar flowing and stay within our 1-hour goal, we have muted everyone. However, we want to hear from you. So if you have a question, would you please post those in the Q&A section, and we will address those at the end of the presentation. It's my pleasure to turn the program over to my co-host today, Mandy Archer. She is with the Blue Ridge Crossroads Small Business Development Center, who will introduce our presenter and take over the webinar. Mandy, it's all yours.
All right. Thank you, Sandy. I appreciate it. So good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm Mandy Archer. I'm with the Small Business Development Center. I'm here in Galax, Virginia, serving the Twin Counties. And so we are excited to be part of this 8th session for our Rebuild and Refocus webinar series. Today's topic is key technologies and cybersecurity needs. The key, it might be a little bit longer than that, but we're going to shorten it for this part of it. Technology and cybersecurity needs are a necessary task in completing your business resiliency plan. That is why we're excited to have Jonathan Evenden with us today. Jonathan is President and CEO of Aegis IT. Did I say that right, Jonathan?
Aegis, but yeah.
Aegis IT, a company that focuses on using technologies to address business and operational issues. Jonathan did begin working with enterprise IT solutions in 2005, and he says he's a self-proclaimed geek at heart, meaning that he began working on and fixing computers in the mid-90s. So with a business degree in hand and passion for helping entrepreneurs figure out how IT can fix business problems, he began Aegis, right? IT in 2012. Thanks for being with us, Jonathan. Sorry I stumble over your name. Maybe you can correct me on that through this.
That's fine. I appreciate the introduction. Here is the PowerPoints. So the very short title of this presentation is Key Technologies and Cybersecurity Needs, Available Technology and Application Resources to Assist Business Needs. So I was asked to cover 2 separate topics, essentially, and we'll get into that real quick. I gotta bring this back to PowerPoint. Okay, there we go. All right, so quick introduction for me. In addition to what Mandy has said, I basically got into computers in the mid-90s. about junior high. It's something that is a passion and a hobby that has turned out to support myself and my employees. It's something I get really excited about. And when I'm not fixing computers for pay, I'm fixing computers for fun. So that's who I am. I started in enterprise IT when I started working at a bank back in 2005. This was shortly after graduating college. I got into IT consulting formally in 2006 and have never looked back. I started Aegis IT in 2012. We are located in Kingsport, Tennessee. I live in Bristol, Virginia personally, and we cover a pretty wide range. We go, we've got a client as far north as Radford. We go out to Oak Ridge. We go almost into Kentucky, and we've gone down into North Carolina for clients. That's just the in-person. We do remote support all over the US. Aegis IT itself, we do hardware and software support for computers. That means we sell computers, laptops, servers, networking equipment, you name it, we can pretty much provide it. We also provide managed IT services. So we manage antivirus, backups, content filtering, patch update, and remote access as well. And finally, and the most pertinent that we're going to spend a good amount of time talking about today is disaster recovery and prevention. And I've got a number of slides dedicated to that, especially focusing on the business side and the implications for how to prevent and handle disasters. So the overall topics for this presentation, one, they asked me to discuss recovering from disaster. Basically, how would you handle if something critical went down? And we're going to focus on that from the IT resource standpoint. And I'm going to talk about three particularly key topics in that realm. I'm going to talk about communications. So that's going to be your email and phones. We're going to discuss your line of business applications. Maybe that's QuickBooks. Maybe that's Salesforce. Maybe that's your CRM platform. Maybe you have industry-specific software, such as our dental clients have software that's specifically targeting dental offices, and our attorneys have have software that's specifically targeting attorney document preparation and managing wills and managing estates and titles and everything. So there will be specific to your industry as well. And then finally, we're going to talk about managing remote employees, because that has become a considerable topic within this past year. Remote work was something that would happen, but it wasn't the norm. And because of COVID and social distancing and the delightfulness that 2020 has presented with us, remote has become almost essential to be able to do that. So a question is, how do you manage those employees? How do you keep track of time and make sure people are actually working instead of spending time on Facebook all day? Then the second major topic that I was asked to discuss is how to prevent and respond to data breach. In case that term is new to you, and partly because I don't know entirely who all I'm speaking to today, but data breach is if critical information such as social security numbers or bank accounts or credit card numbers is leaked to the public as a result of your network. So maybe an employee clicks on a link and all of a sudden your network is infected and someone's managed to pull 15 million credit card numbers. Or if you're Experian, they've pulled a whole lot more than that with a whole lot more information. Or if you're Target or say Yahoo, when Yahoo breached, what was it, like 2 billion, 4 billion? It was a rather large number. It was in the billions. This was last year, 2 years ago. It was a recent breach with Yahoo, and they had billions of records that were breached as a result of an infection. So we're going to talk about cybersecurity. We're going to talk about antivirus, firewalls, monitoring, sandbox software. What are some practical things that you can do for your business without spending crazy amounts of money trying to maintain security? Talk about social engineering. What that means is social engineering is a common tactic people use to break into networks. Basically, I could call up and pretend to be someone from your IT department, and I could convince an employee to give me their passwords. Or I could walk in dressed as the fire inspector and get physical access to the building while pretending to do a fire inspection. These are very common tactics for people who do penetration testing for a living when they're paid to break into people's networks to find the weak points, and social engineering is extremely effective. And then finally, we're going to talk about backups, because no amount of prevention beats having good backups. That's just the sad state of affairs. And the worst cases of problems and the worst cases of people being taken out from a disaster, either if it's a ransomware attack or a physical destruction of a building, has to do with the level accuracy of backups and how fast that they can restore. So those are the two general topics. These are the three subtopics that I'm going to focus on. Just for the record, any one of these could be an entire multi-hour presentation in and of itself. So I am going to focus on the big picture, essentially. We're not going to get into the nitty-gritty details but yeah, if you have questions, specific questions about this, I'm always happy to discuss offline or afterwards. And the other thing is that many of these go into specific application within your business. So the line of business software that you're going to be using might be different from the line of business software that your neighbors. And that's where each individual company setup and network needs an individual assessment as to how to best determine how best to handle that. Okay. Oh, and insurance. I forgot about insurance. Data breach insurance. That is actually extremely important and has become a bigger issue these days. All right, so let's talk about disaster response in your comms. So as much as people hate email, it is a fact of life. And a excessive amount of communication goes through email. So an important question would be, what happened if your email stopped working? How long would it take for customers to complain? How would not having email cripple your ability to get business done? Would it cripple your ability to get paid? Would it cripple your ability to send sales estimates, invoices, communication with employees? Email is still, as much as many people hate it, it's still an absolutely essential, critical part of our current business environment. So when it comes to your email, you basically got one of two ways of making that work. You either got what's called an on-premise or an on-site solution, meaning you have a server or something in your office that is actively managing your email. Maybe it's an on-site Exchange server. That used to be more of the trend 10 years ago. We had between 10 and 15 years ago, most of our clients had an on-site Exchange server that they would use, and we would set it up and run it and set up spam filtering and backups and all that. Since then, solutions like Gmail and Office 365 have provided a considerably more competitive product. And I have touched maybe one or two systems that are on site within the past 8 years. Almost everything's in the cloud. So it's extremely rare to find an on-premise email server these days. If you're a big company like an Eastman or say Milligan, those are local companies to us in the Tennessee side. If you're a bigger company, there's a better chance of having an on-premise email server, mostly because of the expense. But even that, even very large companies are switching to hosting it externally. Part of it is maintenance, part of it is spam. There's a number of reasons. So when it comes to disaster recovery, the question is, if you have your email on premise and your office goes down, or you can't get to your office physically, whether it's a flood or, well, I guess COVID didn't really keep you out of your office, but you know, there's any number of reasons why you might not be able to get into your office. How are you going to be able to get your email if it's on site? If it's externally hosted and there's a serious problem, such as a major disaster or internet outage, how are you going to be able to handle that as well? Are your employees able to use their email at home? That is something that we run into a surprising amount where people are not necessarily set up for that. I almost take it for granted this day and age that people can get their emails on their phones, people can check their email 24/7, but that's not always the case. So it's just a simple question. Know for your file, where is your email? How are you backing it up? Are you backing it up? And how would people get to it if something major went down? All right, phones. This is more, there's less uniformity on the businesses that we walk into when it comes to phones. So while the general trend is for almost everyone having their email hosted externally, the phone system is something that is pretty evenly split. So you have your choice of an on-site phone system. PBX is just phone bank exchange. It's a term that goes back a long time ago. So it could be that your phone is sitting in a closet, or your phone system sitting in a closet. If it's 15 plus years old, it could be a Nortel, it could be an Avaya. It could be, it's basically just a box on the wall, and it handles all your incoming calls. Other options, and this is actually the direction that we're seeing more, is hosted voice over IP. So instead of having a box in your office, you have a phone that connects to the internet and can be picked up and moved to another location. In fact, many of the hosted phone providers will also have apps on cell phones. So if you got your smartphone, you can log into your phone extension, and now you're making work phone calls from your cell phone without giving out your cell phone number. That's a huge win. We have a number of clients that want to be able to take their phones with them, but they don't want to give up people their private cell phone. And so that allows the best of both worlds. Your phone travels with you, but you don't have to give out your cell phone number. So we end up doing more hosted VoIP these days. We are a reseller for a particular vendor that we like, that we use. With these kind of setups, there's less one-time layout. So like with an on-site phone system, if you got a couple of phones, you're still going to be spending a couple of grand right up front to be able to buy the phone system, buy the phones, and then you've got your ongoing cost to pay for your phone lines. With a hosted VoIP system, you buy the phones once. If they go out, you know they go out, but you're not paying for infrastructure to have it. And so there's a great amount of appeal, especially with mobility. So the issue with COVID has been anyone with an on-site phone system, those are not going to be accessible from home. You have to be in the office, and your phones have to be tied to that physical phone box in order to get it to work. So there's no mobility. With hosted VoIP, if you need to have a bunch of people work from home, they could unplug their phone, take it home, plug it up, boom. They're online and they're making phone calls, and it says, it shows the company name, they have their extension, and it's a significant amount of mobility. So if there's an outage, the question is, what kind of phone system do you have? How fast can you get those phones moved to somewhere else if you need to? Like, let's say your office is down. If you've got an on-site phone system, you're going to have a harder time getting those phone numbers forwarded somewhere else. Your options are limited. If you got a hosted phone system, you can take your phone, take it home, plug it up, and you're done. Group video. This has also been considerable. This has also been seeing an incredible rise. I wish I'd bought Zoom stock back in 2019, apparently, because they have gone through the roof. You're talking common platforms are Teams, Microsoft Teams, Zoom, Skype, Google Meeting. There's any number of them. They all have their own little ecosystem. I'm in a professional networking group called BNI. We have been meeting online through Zoom since April, and we don't know when we're going to go back to in-person meetings. Hopefully soon. But we're literally functioning as a group of salespeople entirely online, entirely over Zoom. I have one vendor that I use heavily, and his employer has prevented him from going on site for sales calls. And so he's doing all his implementation setup and sales over Zoom. And for those of us who spend a large amount of time in the car, because I spend a lot of time in the car driving from site to site, video chat has been extremely helpful. I'm thankful for it. There are times when instead of driving an hour, I can do the business over Zoom or Skype or FaceTime. That's not always the case, especially if I have to handle hardware or physical cabling, or if it's anything tangible, then there's a lower chance of being able to do it over a group chat. But for discussing projects, for discussing implementation, some of the sales, that can be done over group. So a question is, are you guys, are you using group video in your business? Are you using it in lieu of in-person meetings? It's just it has been extremely helpful, especially for handling disaster response. All right, so disaster response line of business. This is going to be a bit more particular to your business because I won't know off the top of my head what software you're using. So an important question to ask is, what line of business software do you use? Is the software on-site or hosted? So what I mean by that is a very common piece of software that we run into is QuickBooks. Probably QuickBooks is the number 3 on our list of software that we support the most at clients. So if you factor Microsoft Windows and Microsoft Office, they're sort of neck and neck as to number 1 and 2. Those are the two largest pieces of software that we see the most at clients. After that is definitely QuickBooks. We do a ton of QuickBooks support. I've been supporting QuickBooks for a very long time, probably close to 20 years. Not from an accounting side. Don't ask me to set up your chart of accounts, but we do, we help people get multi-user mode, work remotely, and so on and so forth. Updates, fixing corrupted company files. So the question is, are you using QuickBooks Online? Do you have QuickBooks Desktop installed on a computer in your office? Do you need multiple people to get into QuickBooks when it's installed in your office? If there's a problem at the office and you can't get to the office, how fast can you get QuickBooks somewhere else? How fast can you get QuickBooks installed on another computer and back into your company file? For some people, that might not be super critical. Maybe they invoice once a week, or they don't go into QuickBooks every day. Other people, I've got clients where not having QuickBooks is a critical failure. So we've got one client that has 20 people in QuickBooks all day long. If those 20 people can't get into QuickBooks, they're not doing business, they're not selling, they're not making money. It is a serious, serious problem. So in that particular case, they have spent resources and time and money to get a super robust solution, and it runs well as a result. And if they had a problem, we could fail it over to one of the other servers, or we could take a company file and do something else with it. We can move them around. We can restore for backup. They're pretty well covered. But are you covered? How are you set up? And how fast can you get your line of business software back up and running in the event of a, say, server failure or internet failure or some other failure? All right. So in relation to directly related to that, what backups do you have? Because if you have a disaster, something takes out your office, something takes out your network, how fast can you get back up and running? And the question will be, how good are your backups? We shoot for both on-site and off-site backups at every client. Reason for that is on-site is faster to restore from. Off-site is basically your insurance policy. So on-site will pretty much always be faster than downloading off the internet. We had one time where the client didn't want to do off-site backup. Client didn't want to do on-site backup, so all we had was off-site backup. They got ransomware, and it took probably 12 hours to download all their files and have everything back up and running. Whereas that would have been maybe a 1 hour restore time if it had been on-site. And that's just the difference between downloading it over the internet and restoring it locally, either over your network or USB or however you want to do your local backups. The answer to this question will be also contingent on how much, what is your backup size? How much do you actually have to back up? Because if you're talking terabytes, that's going to be a whole different scenario than if you're talking gigabytes. And if you're talking tens of terabytes or hundreds of terabytes, and there are places that have to back that up, those are all different scenarios and have to be designed differently than a typical small business. A typical small business, we can usually get multiple sets of backups with a USB drive or a large NAS or a SAN, and then do offsite as well. It just depends on the business. It depends on how much you're saving. Depends on your line of business software. That would require an individual assessment. And you have support contracts with vendors. This is a huge deal. We have had clients where they've got some critical piece of hardware or some critical piece of software that they're running their business on, and it has a problem. Maybe it fails, maybe it dies, maybe it won't turn on. Maybe there's a corruption and now the software stopped working. Maybe they got ransomware and they don't have the information to reinstall it. And then lo and behold, they come to discover that they don't have a support contract with the vendor, and the vendor's not going to want to talk to them. So sometimes you can play it fast and loose with support contracts. I tend to not like not having support contracts, especially if your entire business runs on that. It's extremely helpful to be able to pick up the phone and talk to somebody when you're in the middle of a fire. So that becomes a business decision, because sometimes those support contracts can be really expensive, and I totally understand that. Sometimes you can get away with it, and sometimes you're really setting yourself up for failure if you don't have that. That once again comes down to an individual assessment of who the vendor is. Will they still talk with you? How fast can you get your support contract renewed? And that's just that becomes an individual assessment, but it's an extremely important question to discuss. And what are in some of the common software that we see, QuickBooks, Adobe, we have lots of clients that use Adobe. Adobe has its own special redheaded stepchild that has all sorts of problems, especially once you get into professional Photoshop and other. The more products you get at once, the more problems it has. Microsoft Office, lots of Microsoft Office problems and issues that we deal with on a daily basis. All right, a couple more things. If you have an on-site setup, how fast can you move your servers to a new location? Let's say that there is a physical problem with the building and you need to be somewhere else. How fast can you get your equipment to another location? How fast can you have internet turned up? And that's a pretty important question. That becomes a planning question, because there are companies, if they're bigger and they have a bunch of servers, that's a much harder move. You need to have that equipment planned out in advance. If you're a smaller company and you've got a single server and you got a problem, it's pretty easy to shut down a single server and move it to a new location. Like, it's just one server versus a bunch of servers. That's a whole different scenario. But I would say know that in advance and be able to plan it in advance, because you don't want to be making those decisions when you're right in the middle of the problem. And if your system is set up on site, how fast can you set up remote access if it's not already enabled? If you've got a problem with your office, chances are people are not going to be able to come and do it and work. Especially with COVID, when they're having people work from home, we did a lot of remote setups for people. In our case, it's a one-time setup, because once you got your remote access, you're usually in pretty good shape. But do you have the resources in place? Do you have a terminal server? Are you having people connect directly to their desktops? How are they connected to their desktops? Is it a secure remote access? Do you have policies in place about when and how, and is it monitored? Is the connections monitored? Do you have the ability to check how long they've spent remotely accessed? Those are all things that we can help with and plan for. Is it secured? Do you have a static IP? Sometimes if you've got a terminal server, you need a static IP. This becomes, once again, specific to your business. It becomes a question of how you're set up. Do you have on-site? And these are all questions that we run through with our clients, just to make sure that we've got them the resources that they need. This becomes pretty critical as well. Do you take credit cards? Do you have a physical device to do credit cards? If you can't access your physical device, can you still get paid? A number of places will have online processing capabilities. We have clients where they've got the bank check scanners, because they get such a high volume of checks that the banks don't want to talk to them, or they're going to charge them a transaction fee. If you don't have access to any of those, can you still get paid? Can you still process credit cards? That's an often overlooked question that would interrupt your cash flow. Once again, company specific. Disaster response. Let's talk about employees. Do you have hourly employees? A lot of places do. Do those hourly employees still want to get paid, even if they're working remotely? How do you plan on tracking that time? That's a pretty serious problem. And there's a wide variety of responses that I've seen, from installing basically keyloggers and monitoring on computers to time clocks that people can check in and check out remotely. We have solutions that we've set up for clients where they can check in over the web on a time clock. It works really well. Generally pretty happy. Now, once again, you can record the IP address and the physical location of where they're clocking in. That doesn't necessarily mean it's that person. Biometric is always a more accurate way of having people clock in. Like a thumb or an eye or something like that, or a face. But when you're having people work remotely, that's not necessarily a feasible solution. So the next best thing that we've done is using basically a web-based payroll check web-based time tracking solution that will record the IP address and the geographic location for where someone checked in, and then you can compare. But you still probably want to track your time, and your employees still probably want to get paid when you're working remotely. And how are they accountable? So that's where the time tracking can come in. That's where monitoring of computers can come in. Sometimes we've seen people, there's a wide variety of responses once again. And part of the way to answer that is, are people working from their own equipment or company provided equipment? If they're working from company equipment, there's basically no expectation of privacy. I'm not a lawyer. I won't pretend to be one. I don't play one on TV, but I do know from a legal standpoint that there is no expectation of privacy on company equipment, whether that's phones or laptops or desktops. Consult your attorney if you're not sure. However, if it's their home computer, that's a whole different legal issue. And while you can, you as the employer can install monitoring software, you might not want to. That would be specific to the state you're in. In some places, even the country, different countries have different laws when it comes to this. And you definitely don't want to open yourself up to lawsuit. At least I don't want to open myself up to lawsuit just because I want to be able to track time. So that would be definitely something to know in advance before you install or make any policies. All right, different options for tracking. Sometimes it can be software that takes screenshots every minute or every 30 seconds. Sometimes it's as simple as keystroke logging. There's different solutions out there. All right, let's talk about prevention from a cybersecurity standpoint. So the single biggest issue that I run into when it comes to cybersecurity is people want to buy a box or buy a piece of software and declare themselves to be secure. We bought this firewall. We are now secure. And it just does not work that way. Security is basically a moving target. What's secure today might not be secure tomorrow because they've discovered a bug or an exploit or a vulnerability that now all of a sudden they have to patch and update in order to prevent. So it is a painful moving target. And the practices change as well. So the things that we do for security today are very, very different than what we're doing 10 years ago and even more drastically 20 years ago. So yes, core concepts like antivirus and firewalls haven't changed, but the way to implement them and the underlying technology has drastically changed. So your basic steps are your antivirus software, firewalls so that you're not open to the internet, spam filters, content filtering. We deal with a lot of viruses. We clean a lot of computers. I've found that even a basic content filter goes a long way in terms of keeping viruses off computers. It's pretty drastic, the amount of viruses that we clean between clients that don't have even a basic content filtering and clients that do. So this is your baseline. If you're not doing any of these four, you're asking for trouble. Additional things are your IPS, your IDS. That's intrusion prevention and intrusion detection. That gets into the size of the company. If you're a small company, you're not going to be paying for equipment that is going to be able to handle that. That gets pretty expensive pretty quickly. If you're a larger company, you're probably looking into that or investigating that. And sometimes those require people to be like individual IT admins to manage those kind of systems, gateway monitoring, gateway filtering. These are typically subscription-based. They typically need bigger hardware. It really depends on the organization. It really depends on how many offices you have. It depends on how many people are connected. That gets into an individual assessment of your company to decide how you want to handle that. Secure web browsers. This has become extremely important. So NoScript and AdBlock are plugins that originally started with Firefox, and you can now install them for Chrome, and you can now install them for Edge or Internet Explorer. Well, really Edge, because Internet Explorer doesn't have plugins. What this does is, by default, it prevents JavaScript from running on a website. That's what NoScript does. So the biggest source of exploits are malicious JavaScript, which is code that runs on a website, and malicious advertising. NoScript and AdBlock work in conjunction with each other to prevent those things from happening. One of my favorite examples is a client. This was back in 2009, I want to say. Client had got a virus, and we cleaned the computer, and it was good for a week. A week later, she calls us up, hey, I've got a virus again. So we get in there, we wipe the computer, set it up again, calls back a week later, guys, I've still got a virus. And so we get in there and clean it up and install no script and ad block, and suddenly there's no more problems. What had happened is she had the New York Times as her homepage. And for about a month in, I want to say September 2009, the New York Times was serving up a Trojan through their advertising network. And so they were not directly managing their advertising platform. They had outsourced it to a third party. The third party was not doing any verification of the ads that were coming in. And so for at least a month, the New York Times, which was getting 10 million hits at the time for a month, was serving up a Trojan. And my client had it as her homepage. And so once we put ad block, that prevented that ad from ever loading in the first place, and she had no more issues. No script, basically, we don't widely deploy these to clients because they tend to break websites. So if you were to turn these two plugins on and you went to CNN.com, the page just is going to look terrible. It's not going to load. Entire sections of it just are not going to work because you have to go in and manually enable scripts. So it adds a certain, it adds a burden to the user to make the website work correctly, but it is unparalleled when it comes to security because everything is turned off by default unless you specifically want it to work. And the clients that we've trained on this, because it does take training, you do need to be a bit adventurous when it comes to technology and understanding what it is you're allowed. They just do not have problems. It's amazing. Sandboxy is a sandboxed container. So what that means is you can load a program and any changes made within that program go away as soon as you close it. So you could open up a web browser in a sandbox environment. You could click on a virus. It could run amok on your computer. And as soon as you close it, the entire damage is done. It's also incredibly potent when it comes to security. But once again, there's a pretty high barrier for user training to make sure, because once again, things break. You have to learn and understand how to use it. But these three things are unbelievable when it comes to security, because they also, so things like antivirus, they protect against known threats. You have to know that there's a virus, and you have to know what the definitions are, and you have to know what the behavior is in order to block it. No script, ad block, and sandboxy, they don't care. They're going to protect against future events and future problems that no one knows about because they're not going to be able to run by default. So secure email, spam filtering, alerts for outside email. It's not uncommon for vendors to, if I email back and forth with them, it says, big external email. And that's a good way of alerting people to the fact that it's not an internal email. Then again, there's many times when the threat will come from the inside. So please, for the love of all that is good, change default passwords. I can't tell you how many times we've seen major problems from people not changing default passwords. One time we were the subcontractor, fourth removed kind of deal. And it was with Fortune 100 that was doing work for another Fortune 100, and we were just maintaining the hardware. And so the programmer did not change the default password for a web-enabled website. And someone got in, and in the period of 2 weeks, ran up a bill for $200,000 for bandwidth. Because of the data center that it was hosted in, it's basically called surge bandwidth. You could get more bandwidth if you needed it. You paid considerable amounts of money for it. So someone hacked into the server because it was using a default password for a website, and they used it to attack another server somewhere else. And that was a $200,000 mistake because they didn't change the default password. So that was a pretty painful lesson. Now, in their case, it's a Fortune 100, $200,000 is, the project manager wasn't particularly happy, but they're not going to go out of business because of it. For someone like me, $200,000, that's a pretty serious mistake. I'd be in a lot of trouble because we're not that size. So default passwords can be extremely destructive if someone figures out the default passwords and gets in that way. All right, other additional cybersecurity policy of least permission. What that means is Make sure that people have only the most amount of passwords and permissions that is required for that role. So if someone is answering the phones, for example, and that's all that they do, they probably don't need access to your payroll in QuickBooks, unless you're paying for them for that role. But if all they're doing is answering the phones and they're just routing calls, they don't need access to your accounting system. They don't need access to HR. They don't need, it's, you give them only the amount of permissions that they need to properly accomplish that role. Great issue that we run into is permissions on people's computers. So can people install anything they want to on their computers, on their work computers? Or are they not administrators? Do they need a password to be able to install anything that they want to? Because it's not uncommon for someone to click on a link or click on a website and all of a sudden a virus is installed in the background, and it works because people are local administrators and they can do whatever they want to. It's not uncommon for us to walk into businesses, small businesses especially, and find that this is the case. The larger the company, the less chance that there is that this is actually happening. But once again, it's an individual assessment thing. And can employees access any files or systems on the servers? I've had clients tell me that they want everyone to access everything. I just look at them. I go, okay, well, I don't recommend it, but if that's what you want, then that's what you want. Once again, the larger the company, the less likely this is going to be the case. But because we do end up servicing rather small companies, I do get situations where people want everyone to have access to everything, and I just try to smile and nod. And our line of business applications locked down for security. What that means is QuickBooks, for example, and I keep using QuickBooks because we have so many clients that run off of it. QuickBooks has the ability to give access to certain sections of QuickBooks. So you could have someone that's entering your invoices that does not have access to the credit cards or does not have access to the payroll. You can lock that down. Once again, we see a lot of times where that doesn't happen and everyone has full access to everything. So that's a pretty good way to cause a problem, especially if someone rips off all your information. And then do you actively know who has access to what resources? Maybe it's files, maybe it's line of business software, maybe it's the ability to install software, maybe it's access to hardware. Do you actively know? Do you have a list? Can you pull up the list and say, I know that this employee has access to this, 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 and this? Many places don't. That's a planning and an organizational issue. That's not a technology issue. That's a management issue. One place I worked prior to getting consulting, it was a bank. And one of the things that they did is they had a new hire list and a termination list. And the new hire list had basically a series of checkbox. What do they need access to? And the hiring manager would check off they need this, and they need this, and they need this. And IT would have a record of what they set up for that employee. And then when they were fired, there was a similar checklist, or terminated or left, or whatever the reason was that they were not with the company. There's a similar checklist that they could run through to say, we have deactivated this person on these systems. And there was a record of it. And you have a list of permissions. You know who has, once again, that gets back to who has access to what. Permissions are do they have access to this particular Excel spreadsheet, or this access to, area of QuickBooks. This becomes incredibly important if you have to fire somebody, especially if they're a key employee. We've seen it happen plenty of times. And how might this change in the event of working remotely? So those are very important questions, and they're specific to your organization. All right, we're going to try and move things along here, because once again, these are all large topics and I could go for hours on all of these. All right, so let's talk about prevention. Social engineering, the bottom line is people will always be the weakest link. Like that's just a hard reality. People are the ones that let someone in the front door. People are the ones that let someone get physical access to the systems. People are the ones that don't change the default passwords. People are the ones that click on the link in the email that installs the virus. That's just how it goes. So common ways of getting around that: email, phishing, and yes, it's spelled that way on purpose. You get an email from Chase saying that there's an overdraft in your account. Please click on this link in order to see what this is. And then you click on the link and it takes you to some random looking domain that has some random looking website that's asking you for your username and your password and your social and your bank account, your credit card, and your mother's maiden name, and the name of your first pet, and all the other normal questions that go into password recovery. This is called phishing. It's really bad, and it's really effective. The reason we keep seeing it is because people keep clicking the links. If people would just stop clicking links, it wouldn't work, and we stop getting this. but you keep getting them because they work. There are services that test your employees. So you can pay for services that will send test emails to your employees to see how they respond, and anyone that fails can go back into training. There's also training. This could be, demonstrations of what a bad email looks like. There's any number of ways you can train. One excellent way, and this is a service that we offer, is setting DMARC and DKIM, domain-based message authentication, reporting, and conformance, as well as domain key identifier. Now, what this does is once it's fully implemented, it prevents anyone from sending an email as you. So you're essentially setting up, here's a list of people that are authorized to send with my domain name. And that's it. Anyone else that tries to send, that pretend to be you, is going to fail. This is, from an IT standpoint, it's easy to set up, but if you don't do it right, you will literally break your email and you won't be able to send your own email. So there's a proper way to implement it. It does take some time. It takes some monitoring. We have the single biggest issue we run into when we implement it is vendors that don't support it. And that's actually a pretty serious problem. I've had implementations completely held up because a vendor won't support it and they need that vendor to function. So this is a service that we offer. There's usually a one-time setup fee, and then there's ongoing monitoring to make sure that nothing is broken in the meantime. But it is also extremely effective because you deny the ability to send email as you. And acceptable use policies, this becomes a paperwork thing. Training staffs to secure passwords. You can force people to change passwords. There's really nothing that beats training, to be honest. No amount of technology will fix an employee that just wants to do something and doesn't know any better. All right, let's talk about recovery when it comes to backups. What backups do you have in place right now? Do you know? Do you have proof? Do you get alerts? Do you have a record of what occurred or logs? We get about 100 some odd alerts a day, and we go through and we check every single one, and then we check the ones that we didn't get, because not getting a backup alert is even worse than getting a failure. And when was the last time you tested restoring from your backups? Taking backups is great, but you do not want to discover that you have a corrupted backup when you go to restore. And yes, I've seen that happen. That was a bit more common back when the backup method was tape, because tape was a bit, I have a love-hate relationship with tape backups. They're messy. There are places where tape is the only way you can back it up because the data set, you can store extremely large amounts of backups on tape. It also takes an incredible amount of time to restore from. So I'm glad that most of our backups are not on tape these days. How long did it take to restore? So like I said, the one client that had to download ransomware, it took 12 hours to download. If I had had a local backup that I could have restored from, that would have been about an hour. How badly is your business affected in a 12-hour downtime versus a 1-hour downtime? How well did it work? Did you get all your files back when you did the restore? Were you missing data? Was there stuff that changed between last night and this morning? Was there stuff that, did you have to go to backup from a month ago? That's extremely important to know what data is being captured in your backup stuff. And what backup layers do you have in place? This is where I talk about on-site and off-site. They work in conjunction with each other. When it comes to backups and the total count, I always subtract one. So if you have an on-site backup and an off-site backup, I count that as having one backup, because that gives you, that's basically what it's going to be like in reality. It could fail and you not discover it for a long period of time, in which case you have one less than what you actually think you have. So for security purposes, for planning purposes, I always subtract one from the total number of backups that are in play. And how often are your backups checked? And who responds to those failures? Is it going, if you're getting alerts, they're going to an office manager who doesn't know what to do in response to that backup or in response to that failure. So we get the alerts, we respond to them, at least for the backups that we do get alerts for. And we're in a position to be able to check those. Data breach insurance. I am not an insurance salesman. I'm not licensed to sell insurance, but this has become an incredibly important topic in the context of ransomware. Ransomware or leaked data becomes the biggest sources of having to call in data breach insurance. I say an if or a when. It's the number of breaches that have occurred is rather high, and if you haven't linked data yet, there's a pretty good chance that you will, unless you know, if you have no policies in place, if you've got no plan in place, you're significantly increasing your chances of leaking data. But the question is, how do you respond? Do you know what to respond? Do you know what to do? Do you contact the affected people right away? Do you call the credit unions, or not the credit unions, the FICO reporting, the agencies, Experian and Transamerica and whatnot? Do you call them right away on behalf of people? The numbers reported all over the place. Supposedly in the first quarter, there were 8 billion records breached. The problem is that no one knows exactly. This is just one estimate from one source. The average cost of a breach also varies by industry, size of the company. I've seen estimates between $3 to $4 million in response. Those are factoring in the super big ones like a Yahoo and a Target and Experian. It also depends on if you have an under 200-day response time or an over 200-day response time. I saw that as a metric. I don't necessarily understand it myself as to why the 200-day becomes, but supposedly when it comes to the length of how long it's going to take to respond to it and what the costs are associated, going over 200 days increase your costs drastically. Data breach insurance does not prevent it, but it helps with the cost of mitigation. So usually a data breach insurance policy will have some sort of amount that you have to hit, and then once you hit over that limit, then they start covering it, or they'll give you a fixed amount of money per incident, you know, per record up to a certain amount of money. It depends on the policy, it depends on your agent, it depends on whether it's a separate policy or whether it's part of your general business liability policy. It's become more and more common to include data breach in your general business liability policy. You can still get your own standalone policy. It really just depends. The factors that go into the cost include how many records you have that you could potentially leak. So if you're a bigger company, you've got millions of records, your cost is going to be higher than if you're a smaller company and you've got thousands. I don't know if you got a good insurance agent. This is the one I use. He is extremely knowledgeable. Andrew is great. He's great to work with, and he is a fantastic resource for data breach policy as well as general business. So that's my plug to one of my clients who also, he handles pretty much all my insurance for my company. All right. So let's talk about other non-COVID disasters as we're starting to get close to 1 o'clock hour. So there are plenty of reasons why you're going to have an IT emergency that's not related to COVID. And while the focus of these talks is really surrounding around COVID and how to deal with it, we just want to make sure that you're aware that there are plenty of other things that will affect you once this is all said and done. We had flooding. I didn't have a picture of it. I took a picture of what the outside looked like. Client has a river in their backyard, essentially. It's a good 100 meters away. One of the recent storms here back in the spring, they had more water than I think that they've ever had in 30 years. The water came all the way up, and they got about 4 inches of water in their main office. And they lost all the computers on the first floor. So thankfully the server was upstairs. It was kept dry. There was no issues. Everything was good. But they did lose all their computer equipment, as well as a firewall and a cable modem and a few other things because of flooding. And that was once in a 50-year flood, or whatever they gauge that metric by. Recently saw pictures of a client that had a fire. In this particular case, it was doing some landscaping, so they had a bunch of 0-point turn riding mowers and equipment related to mulching and a whole bunch of things. That's a pretty serious problem, because once that fire occurs, you're gonna have a pretty hard time recovering that equipment. It's gonna be damaged by smoke. It's gonna smell terrible. And in their case, it's gonna be an insurance nightmare for a whole bunch of complicating reasons that I can't go into because that might identify who the person is. But it's gonna be awful. I'm glad I'm not in the middle of that one. Might not seem like a big disaster, but this day and age, when companies can't function without internet, once had a client that got 2 separate lines, 2 separate internet connections from 2 separate providers because they were concerned about if one went down, And guess what? Both went down at the same time. Someone was doing maintenance in the area, and they knocked over the pole that had both internet connections coming in, and they were down for over a day. That was a pretty serious problem. So you're talking a company with 90 employees, and no one can work because they depend on the internet. So that was a pretty serious disaster in the fact that you've now lost an entire day's worth of productivity from that many people. You have larger disasters like 9/11 that will have implications for years afterwards. I've lived in a variety of places around the country, grew up in Southern California, and I was actually living in New Jersey at the time when 9/11 occurred, right outside New York City. And so I had clients up there and friends that were directly affected by it, and continued to be so for years after the fact. Like Cantor Fitzgerald had a friend that worked there pretty high up, and he was dealing with the mess of 9/11 for something like 7 or 8 years after the fact, just because of all the implications and how many people they lost in 9/11, how many employees, and it was a mess. So something like that can be a big deal. All right. Ransomware is something has been extremely effective in terms of getting people to pay up. It is holding your files hostage. Basically, they come if you get malicious software, it will encrypt your files and tell you that you need to send X amount of dollars to this location, typically in Bitcoins because it can't be reversed. And then they'll give you the password back. Sometimes you get your data back, sometimes you don't. Pretty much the only way to handle ransomware is backups. We've had 2 clients that have permanently lost data to ransomware. In both cases, they were not using backup methods that we suggested. I am extremely, well, there was one client that we had an issue with their backups, and there was some data loss resulting in that. But other than that, all the other clients that we've had with backups, we've been able to recover successfully. So that's a pretty serious problem, and it's something that we've encountered more. I would say that ransomware has affected our clients more than COVID. If you look over the entire time that we've been dealing with ransomware, and I first started seeing ransomware probably about 15 years ago. All right, we are almost at 1 o'clock, so I could keep talking for the rest of the day, but that's the prepared material. And I know it's a very large amount of topics and a very large list, so I am ready for any questions.
That's great. Jonathan, this has been very informative. We do have a few questions we'll try to go ahead and get through before time's up. The first one is, if you use a hosted voice over IP and the internet goes down, what are backup systems you recommend to be able to allow communications to employees and customers? Great question.
Cell phones. So apps on your cell phone, or put your cell phone on a hotspot, or a second internet connection. That is the one chink in the armor. It does need internet. It doesn't need a whole lot of internet, but it does need internet. So the vendor that we use, I can be on my cell, and I can place phone calls as long as I've got decent cell signal.
And I think, and you had mentioned that there's ways to connect your voice over IP to cell phones with it still almost being anonymous in a way, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, so there's an app, so we use a company called 8x8, but almost all of the voice over IP vendors will have an app for Android or an app for iPhone, and it basically becomes a whole separate phone system that runs from your cell phone.
Okay.
So anytime I place a call from my 8x8 app, it's calling as the work number. Now in my case, I give up my cell phone to anybody and everybody. And so I got clients that call me directly, but for other clients, like we just set up somebody, they don't want people to know what their cell phone is. So they've got that app, and anytime they call from the app, it's going to show the caller ID of the business work number, and that's it. No one will know their cell phone unless they give it to them.
Great. Okay. The next question is, basically in your experience, how safe are Zoom and other video platforms to use?
That's a loaded question. The reason it's loaded is because we have no way to inspect it. So so something like Zoom, that's a private company. They don't release their source code. We can look at So one of the issues that came up earlier in the year is the fact that Zoom was sending data back to China and it wasn't encrypted. So there are ways of discovering that through sniffing packets and some other technology, but because it's a private company, because they don't release their software code, you can't know what all they're doing. We can see the network traffic, but that's different than knowing what the program's actually doing. So I don't know, because only Zoom knows.
Okay. So just not something we can really figure out at this point. Is that?
It becomes a matter of trust, essentially. Right. There are, like I said, they publicly released that, oh, hey, you caught us sending data to China. You caught us doing this all unencrypted. So we're now going to encrypt our phone calls, and we're no longer going to send data to China. So we can see that, because we can see the fact that there's no more packets going to China, and we can see that the fact the packets are now encrypted. But beyond that, I don't technically know what I don't necessarily know what all they're doing on my computer. There are ways of discovering that.
Okay.
You can reverse engineer the executables, but that gets into a whole separate topic.
All right. So another question is, how secure are online payment options or options like Square? Any special measures to take if using or setting those up for your business?
Yeah, so that almost becomes a vendor by vendor question. So I personally don't like Square. I don't like PayPal. I use PayPal because I have clients that insist on paying me through PayPal, and I'm not going to say no to money. So, if they say that the only way that I'm going to get paid is by PayPal, well, there you go. Here's my PayPal link. Yes, please pay me. But I wouldn't base my business on it, because PayPal and Square, they're known to hold money. There's a whole host of reasons to not use them. But when it comes to security, as long as they've got a secure website for, processing transactions. Actually, that was a serious problem for a long time. Square was not securing the transaction between the device and their home office. I think that's been fixed recently. But for a long period of time, more than they want to admit to, they were not securing the transactions.
So maybe the business owners need to try to talk to their vendor when they're setting that up and be sure to ask these questions.
Because I network for a living, I've got a credit card guy that I really, really like, and his stuff is really good and his stuff is secure, and that's part of the reason why I like him.
Okay.
So that becomes a vendor by vendor basis.
Okay. All right. We have just a couple more.
Go for it.
Do you have a recommendation for cloud-based file sharing?
That has changed over the years. It depends on what you need. When it comes to IT, the answer is always it depends. And I hate to say that, but it's true. Because a company where Dropbox works well for one doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work well for another.
Okay.
A company that can do stuff off of Google Docs might not work for another scenario. So I'll run through it this way. The big players are your Dropboxes, your Live. Microsoft wants you to use their live service, and Google for Google Docs and Google Drive. Those are sort of like the really big ones. They have their upsides and their downsides. They all have their disadvantages and their advantages. We use a self-hosted cloud solution called OwnCloud. It's an open source software. I run it on a box. I've got 2 terabytes of space that I can dump whatever, employees can dump whatever they need to on there, and that's how we share our software. That's how we share files with clients, but I have full control over it. But I also maintain it myself. So there's a level of expertise that's involved there that you may or may not have, depending on who you are and what company you work for. It works for us because that means I'm not paying Dropbox, and I've got full control over all the files.
All right, and we'll go to this last question, and it might be it depends answer as well, but
probably.
Many individuals and small businesses typically get the basic cybersecurity tools from one product. Yep. So you're getting like antivirus, firewall, spam, content filter.
Yep.
Do you recommend any one in particular?
Ours, of course.
You have your own. Okay, got it.
Well, we're resellers. We use Viper. It's integrated into our larger platform. So I cannot give you an unbiased opinion on that.
Okay. All right. So
full transparency.
All right. So what you're recommending is you definitely talk to your vendor. You're open to being a vendor in order to obtain, but it sounds to me like that answer.
I have my favorites. Yes, okay. I will. I absolutely have my favorites. So when it comes to antivirus, it almost comes down to which one is the least worse, to be honest. I hate to say it that way, but something like Norton, which was Symantec, used to be really good back in the day, but I haven't used it in years, and I haven't touched it in years because it's such a horrible program at this point. McAfee and Symantec are terrible. They run really slow. I've often described them as a virus because they take over your computer. They're almost impossible to uninstall, and they slow it down, which is basically what a virus does. So, and if you're using that for the cure is worse than the problem.
Okay, so you definitely unfavorites. You can tell.
Yes, I definitely have my unfavorites. And you know, I've sold Kaspersky in the past. I don't do that anymore because they've had their own set of issues, especially with ties to the Russian government. They've been banned in the U.S. by government computers. They're no longer allowed. But that was actually a really good product about 10 years ago, and that was exclusive. That was primarily what we sold 10 years ago, or what I was selling when I was on the company. And I really like the product. And once again, over time, that has changed.
Got it. All right. Well, that was our last question that we had coming from our participants. We are just a little bit of over time on this, but you presented some wonderful information that I know was very interesting to myself and to other individuals. You know, I know that you could go in, like you said, into more detail on each one in that aspect of it. So bottom line, you know, look at this in a future aspect as well as relationships with your vendor and the person that you use. So I'll leave with that. I'm going to turn it back over to my wonderful host, Sandy Ratliff, and thank you folks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. That was fantastic. When you were presenting, I sent Mandy a little text and said, I am learning so much from this and things that I didn't even think about that, that's great. That's what we wanted to do. So I also want to thank those that joined us on the webinar today. Thank you for spending your lunch hour with us. And I hope that you found value as I did in today's session and what Jonathan had to present. I will share Jonathan's presentation on an email, as well as we did record this session today, and we'll send you the link that you can use, or hopefully you're going to share with someone else that can find value in it. Just want to hope that you're making plans to join us next Thursday, which the focus will be key resources, computer contacts, critical information for storage options, and that will be presented by our friends at Gen Edge. So I hope you will make plans to join us. And we are running a little over. So again, thank you, and hope to see you all soon. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for coming.